So today we're very close to home for me, talking about one of AWC's projects in New South Wales, and that's at North Head Sanctuary in Sydney. It's on the very edge of Sydney Harbour in Rewilding country. AWC's work at North Head constitutes a rewilding project right next to Australia's largest city, and we're lucky to have such a big area of intact bush so close to the CBD. It's about 8 kilometres from the centre of Sydney. At North Head, the headland itself is about 250 hectares with lots of different activities going on. So there's National Park, there's some federal land, and there's an area in the middle which is run by Harbour Trust, which is about 74 hectares. And that's the area where AWC has been working now for well over a decade. The headland is diverse. So there's eastern suburbs banksia scrub with lots of different beautiful flowering banksias, heath, woodland, grasslands, ferns, and even literal rainforest in small patches. So it's a very special site for us. It's a place where we've also carried out translocations of 3 locally extinct mammal species, and you might be familiar with this work. So we've now released populations of the native bush rat, Brown Antechinus, one of the small native carnivorous marsupials, and the eastern Pygmy possum, which is I would argue, the cutest mammal in Australia. Alongside this reintroduction work has been an active program of research. And today I'm joined by 2 of the people who have led some of those research projects at North Head over the last few years. So I'll introduce now field ecologist Aiden Wright, joining us from very close to North Head.
Hey Joey, thanks for having us.
Hello. So Aiden has been a volunteer, an intern. He's done an honours project with AWC at North Head and is now employed as a field ecologist. And Angela Raña, who is a PhD candidate right in the middle of her research at North Head. She's also worked as an ecologist at the site and knows it very well. Welcome, Angela.
Thanks, Joey. Thanks for having me.
Aiden, I'd like to start with you. How did you first get involved with this project at North Head?
Well, it goes back to, my volunteering days. So I first found out about the work that was going on out at North Head through a guest lecture by one of AWC's senior ecologists, Jennifer Hansen, back when she was running the North Head program. That originally got me interested in the fact that there's such interesting rewilding projects happening close to our urban centre of Sydney. And then I was lucky enough to follow up that with a honours project researching the genetics of the reintroduced bushrat population. Then after some time off after uni, I started up my internship at North Head at the start of 2021, and then rolled into a field ecologist position now.
Fantastic. So you know the site pretty well, I think we can say. So just to give us a bit of context, why are native mammals required to be reintroduced at North Head? Why are they missing in the first place?
Well, there's a whole suite of native small mammals that are not just missing from North Head, but from the Sydney Harbour foreshore region. And that is due to some of the usual causes that we're familiar with. So habitat loss from increasing urbanisation and predation from introduced cats and foxes. But there's another introduced animal that would have been responsible for the decline of some of Sydney's native small mammals, and in particular the bush rats, and that's the European black rat. So in the early days of European colonisation, black rats also arrived on the scene, and with them came some new diseases. And so these would have directly affected the native wildlife populations, but also had effects on human health as well. And so in the early 1900s, the government actually established a rat bounty program, which aimed to control these black rat populations that were spreading disease. And inadvertently, that would have also resulted in some native animals being caught up in the bounty as well.
Right.
And so there's actually some old black and white photos of native species such as the ricali or the water rat that would have been caught up in these bounties. As a result, there hasn't been the oldest record of a bush rat being found in the Sydney Harbour region dates back to 1901, so quite a while back. And these species have just been missing from the Harbour region and North Head in particular for
So
quite
that's
some time.
like 100 years where basically all the small mammals that would have been there originally have been absent. And yeah, I think what you're describing, I mean, it's kind of like a double whammy that they would have been wiped out by disease, but then also hammered from those government bounties. The numbers involved were just incredible, like tens of thousands of animals being killed fairly indiscriminately. I don't think they were just looking at black rats, but anything small and furry would have got a whack. There's some other interesting history just before we move into your research, which is about the Brown Antechinus, and the first record of one of these animals is actually from very close to there. Can you tell us about that, Aiden?
Yeah, that's right. So a colleague of ours actually came across a article dating back to, I think, 1841, and it's a natural history annals that describes the first ever Brown Antechinus that was discovered from North Head. And so, yeah, this was the first time an Antechinus in general was described by Western science. And yeah, as you can see on the screen now, this is a drawing from that article showing, yeah, the first time an Antechinus species was described.
So that's kind of poignant that this species first described from North Head has then been wiped out very soon after colonization, and it's been missing essentially for decades. So I think we've talked before about our reintroduction, so I won't go too much into that, but I guess I'm interested in the research aspect of these projects. And Aiden, your honours was all about one of the reintroductions. What was the species that you focused on, and what was your main question?
Yeah, so I was looking at the bush rat reintroduction. And as with any reintroduction program, when you're taking one animal from one location, or when you're taking animals from one location and releasing them to another, the aim is to create a population that's as genetically diverse as possible. And so that's what my honours research was looking into. It was essentially assessing what the genetics of the bush rat population out at North Head was like, and whether they've become susceptible to any of the effects that are the result of closed populations like North Head. And because, for North Head, it's essentially an island for these small mammals. So it's bordered by ocean, and the remainder of it is highly urbanized. And so it's an important management consideration to track how the genetics of these reintroduced populations are going.
Yeah, great. And yeah, using genetics to track the health of populations is pretty interesting because, typically we can catch animals, recatch ones if we've microchipped some of them and do population estimates this way. But you're approaching it from, a different angle, I suppose, using genetic samples that have been taken from that population over time. And from that, you can infer how it's grown, but also whether it's maintained that healthy level of diversity. I've got a bush rat on the screen here. Can you talk us through how to tell the difference between one of these and the pest black rat species, the feral ones?
Yeah, for sure. So some of the characteristic features that we look at are the tail. So a bush rat tail is much shorter and much thinner at the base compared to a black rat. And so, you can typically tell when you have a black rat when they have a tail that's much longer than the length of their body. Whereas a bush rat, the tail is normally similar size to their body size. And it's a similar thing with their head shape as well. So a black rat will have a much larger head. In proportion to their body, whereas the bush rats, their head size is a lot more similar to their body size.
Yeah, it's something that for people to do at home is very, very difficult. Quite often for these rodents, you have to look at scale patterns in the tail, sometimes the foot pads, different patterns of foot pads on the underside of their feet. So it can be difficult to tell at first pass. We know that these native species are important ecologically, and we might come to that a little later. But Aiden, that sampling work, it's actually built up from data that's been taken over a long period of time. What did you find when you were looking at the genetics of that population?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, AWC has been collecting these genetic samples for dating back to the original founder population from 2014. And to the point where I was completing my honours project, there'd been 6 years worth of genetic samples had been taken. And so, yeah, my job was to extract the DNA from these samples, send them off for sequencing, and then understand from that how diverse the population was. And we could actually see that the locally born bush rats, and so the population up until 2019, actually retained levels of diversity that were comparable to those original founder populations, which is a great outcome for quite some time after their original release back to North Head.
Fantastic. Yeah, there's more and more focus on this genetic work with our reintroductions. We spoke to Dr. Jenny Pearson last year about some of this work, and she's looking at across the board the releases we've done at New Haven, Mount Gibson, and other other rewilding projects as well. Angela, I might bring you in at this point just to talk a little bit about the roles that these mammals play in the landscape. So if small mammals have been missing from this kind of coastal bush landscape for decades, for 100 years, what are the implications of that? What are we, what processes are we also removing?
Yeah, so one that we've been looking at North Head for a while as part of the science program is the pollination of banksias. So banksias have a pretty distinctive kind of flower spike, and definitely not the normal flower spike that you see with the petals that are a little bit fragile or modifications of petals like that. But yeah, they're pretty sturdy things, and they are pretty long, and they sit quite upright. Yeah, so we were looking at the pollination of these because that modified kind of sturdy spike indicates that it could have evolved to have pollinators that weren't as light as insects or as light as birds. And yeah, they were probably pollinated by these small mammals such as the Antechinus, the bush rats, and the Pygmy Possums as well, that love the nectar. Yeah, so that was originally part of my PhD project.
So yeah, you said originally part of your PhD project, and we'll come to what happened there. So there was a bit of a change of direction. I think everyone's used to the idea of pivoting from our original plans over the last couple of years. What were the big questions you wanted to ask in the PhD that you set out to do?
Yeah, so similar to Aiden's honours project, I was going to look at the reintroductions. So I was going to look at the genetics of the Brown Antechinus and the Pygmy Possums, and I was also going to radio track them. So I think as part of the reintroduction program, we radio track them anyway, but I was going to ask questions around that and kind of where they shelter, what factors kind of dictate where they go once they are released. And yeah, I was going to look at the effect of pollination. So whether over time since reintroductions, whether that increases the seed set of banksias. And I was also doing a manipulative experiment, and I was putting bird nets over banksias. So that way I was hoping to exclude birds from pollinating those flower spikes. And yeah, in that way kind of quantify the contribution of the small mammals for pollination of banksias.
Okay, so pretty important questions about that whole reintroduction was going. Ominously, you're saying that's what you were going to do. What happened? What intervened with that plan?
Yes, so there was unfortunately an uncontrolled burn that, well, it was controlled to begin with, but then it got out of control, and it ended up burning nearly a third of the headland, and it was quite a hot fire as well. So yeah, my original experiments just weren't possible anymore.
Some of the equipment you were using melted, and going back there, a day or two afterwards, that must have been absolutely devastating.
Yeah, it was pretty heartbreaking for a number of reasons. So just with that picture that you have there, before the fire, you basically wouldn't be able to see, 10 meters away even, because the scrub was so dense. So yeah, it was pretty shocking, to be honest. And just not even to do with my PhD, just on like a personal level, because I'd been an intern there in 2018 and continued on with some casual contracts after that. Yeah, I had my own personal attachment to that. So that was just heartbreaking in that sense. Yeah. And then obviously I had to completely change what I was looking at for my PhD as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really, really tough. And that was the same year as COVID hit as well. So a lot to deal with there. Aiden, were you there as well when the fire happened?
So my honours research was actually conducted prior to the fire,
Right.
but then I did start my internship in 2021, and I did see, I guess, the aftermath.
Yeah. Angela, so we mentioned that you pivoted to a new idea for a PhD, and there was, I guess you could say, a silver lining to this opportunity. Earlier in 2020, we'd had the really big bushfires through a lot of southeastern and southwestern Australia, and AWC had been called in to help with some of the bushfire recovery work in different places. And then this fire happened at North Head, so we had a little bit of experience with bushfire response. How did you reshape your PhD, and what's the PhD that you're currently undertaking?
Yeah, to be honest, right when it happened, it was all a bit of a blur. We kind of were just pivoting because we wanted to get these structures out. So as you said, we were helping with the bushfire recovery effort. And we actually had put these artificial refuge tunnels out at Wollongby, working with the landowners there. So I actually had some spare equipment, some chicken wire, shade cloth that, we started putting out at North Head, I think within 4 days of the fire. So yeah, it was clear that my PhD was taking a post-fire recovery direction instead. So we got those out within 2 or 3 weeks, I think. And then I was thinking about what else we could do, and there was still the genetics. So similar to Aiden, there were the genetic samples that I could use to track their diversity over post-fire recovery. And then I also wanted to look at another way of helping animals post-fire. So just to give a bit of background to that, with fire, especially hot fires like the one that happened at North Head, it just kind of completely decimates ground layers, and small mammals really rely heavily on those. So that's why we were wanting to put those tunnels out. And then, we were looking at different options because the tunnels are quite hard to put out. It's a lot of heavy equipment. And then the big thing as well is that you have to take them back down because it's, chicken wire and shade cloth. It's not really part of the natural environment. So we were looking at other options as well. And that's how we came to habitat pods and collaborated with Alex Carthy and Alex Goad from Macquarie University.
Fantastic. Now, I don't know if people are familiar with what we're talking about here. You may have seen the media coverage that we had of this habitat pod project. So, Angela, I'll share a picture, but maybe you can describe these habitat pods. Who came up with them, and how are they supposed to work?
So Alex Carthy, who's at Macquarie Uni, collaborated with Alex Goad, who's also at Macquarie Uni. So they're these little structures that have holes. So the holes are of different sizes. The one that's visible there is to accommodate long-nosed bandicoots. And then ones on the side are for bush rats and Antechinus and Pygmy Possums if they use them. So those are a little bit smaller. And then the holes all along the top are to let sunlight in, because we want to let sunlight into the regrowing veg underneath. And also for invertebrates that might like to hide in the holes.
Okay, and you talked about the habitat tunnels, or the shelter tunnels that we had been using before that, big chicken wire and shade cloth constructions that then had to be sort of extricated months after. The benefits are obvious with these habitat pods. They're made of cardboard, they're biodegradable, so you can get them out in the days or weeks after a fire. They provide that kind of stopgap shelter while animals are really under threat. And I guess it's predators in that post-fire period that makes them especially vulnerable, and just exposure. And then they, gradually disintegrate. So it's a really ingenious solution, and one that absolutely went off on the internet when we posted a story about it. Do you think there's potential for these to be used at a wider scale in bushfire recovery efforts?
I think so. So even just for the fact that they are so light and also relatively cheap, there are even talks that perhaps drones could deploy them in places where it was harder for people to get to, which definitely wouldn't have been possible with the weight of the tunnel equipment. So like in theory, it sounds great for wider use as well. And I do have some very preliminary results of them being used by bush rats and bandicoots. So they are definitely promising.
So I guess to work out whether they're effective, you're having to monitor them with camera traps, right? So I'm interested to hear whether you've seen predators around this area post-fire. I've got a little clip here, but yeah, can you talk us through what kind of animals might be looking for small mammals to eat?
Yeah, so the main issue at North Head is actually aerial predators. So here you'll actually see a magpie, which would definitely beat a bush rat if it wanted to. And coming here is actually a peregrine falcon. Yeah, that would definitely be easy pickings for bush rats and Antechinus, and all the small mammals would be easy pickings for peregrine falcons on the headland.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's an ecological term called landscape of fear, which is to do with places where there's not shelter and animals are, really wary. It places a lot of extra pressure when there's not that shelter and they can't move around freely. But then by nighttime, I guess there's owls potentially as well and pythons. But on the camera traps, you've actually seen animals using these habitat pods. As you said, I've got another little video here.
Yeah, I've gotten bush rats and bandicoots, and I haven't even gone through half of the data that I have yet. So again, it is really promising to see animals use them in the early stages.
Yeah, that's very encouraging. Aiden, back to you. And we've had that big hot year a couple of hot years, 2019, 2020, and then this fire on top of that. But really, since then, it's been quite wet in the East Coast, wetter than average in most places. What's North Head looking like? It's now nearly 2 years after that big hot fire.
Yeah, that's right. We had some good years of rainfall along the East Coast that have definitely helped with the regeneration of the vegetation up at North Head. And compared to when I started my internship back at the start of last year, with the ground out there was still black in some areas where there was not really any sign of vegetation coming back. But yeah, in the year and a bit since, we're definitely seeing very positive signs of regrowth. And surrounding, for example, Angela's refuge tunnels, we have some pictures of what they looked like when they were originally deployed compared to how they looked a few weeks ago when we were pulling them in, and it does look like a completely different landscape again. So it's great to see that it's getting there.
Yeah, it's a slow process. I guess the good news from our point of view is that of those 3 reintroduced mammal species, all of them persisted, and it seems like a lot of them are breeding and continuing to spread.
Yeah, that's right. We survey our reintroduced populations twice a year. We do some small mammal trapping on North Head, and so those in particular are to target the bush rats and the Brown Antechinus. And with our survey that was conducted just back in May this year, we had our highest ever capture rates of both bush rats and Brown Antechinus, which is definitely a positive sign that they're doing well post-fire. And as for the Pygmy Possums, which we monitor 4 times a year with our mess box checks, our most recent round of checks back at the start of this month, actually, again, we had our highest ever capture rates for Pygmy Possums. And so it's great to know that, yeah, all 3 of the reintroduced populations are faring well post-fire.
It's fantastic. Very, very encouraging. One other aspect of your work, Aiden, or the paper you published from your honours, was about the fact that these mammals aren't particularly endangered. So, we talk a lot about bilbies or numbats or bettongs, which are critically endangered or on the brink of extinction in some regions. That's not the case for these small mammals. So why is it important to conserve them and even to restore them back to places like North Head?
Yeah, that's right. So as you mentioned, bilbies and species that are normally the focus of conservation attention are normally those that are on the brink of extinction. Whereas it's the common species that often fly under the radar. But yeah, something that I put forward in the bushrat paper that we published was that common species also deserve a bit of attention because they are also susceptible to the same threats that are driving biodiversity declines. And there was an example just last week that was published of kookaburras and how they're normally considered a common species, but were shown to be in decline in around all of our major cities. But then you also have to consider the ecological role that these common species play and what happens when they're missing from the environment. So for the example of the bush rat, they're known to play a role in pollination and seed dispersal, but having a healthy population of native bush rats running around as well is also a good sign for things that might like to eat bush rats.
Yeah.
So they play an important role in food web dynamics as well. And so, yeah, in essence, by managing these populations of common species, it's part of our effort to make sure that these species stay common. And yeah, I guess the more diversity you have within an ecosystem, it means more resilient they'll be in years to come.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting because a lot of conservation effort and resources are, sending the resources in once something's already critically endangered. Obviously, the ideal is to actually do something about it before things become endangered. So, maintaining healthy populations throughout ecosystems, not waiting until they're critically rare before we actually intervene and do something. Thanks, Aiden, and thanks, Angela, for your discussion about your various projects. That was really, really interesting. I've got a question. I've got lots of questions here, so I'll just come to a few. For the animals that we've reintroduced, where were the source populations for these small mammals?
For starting with the bush rats, they came from a couple of reserves to the north of Sydney. So Ku-ring-gai National Park and Mugamara Nature Reserve. And so, yeah, across 3 years, there were individuals selected from each of these locations and they were mixed and joined together at North Head. Similarly, the eastern Pygmy Possums and Brown Antechinus. Recently, we've been sourcing some of these animals from Ku-ring-gai and Garigal National Parks to the north of Sydney. And originally, some of the eastern Pygmy Possums also came from some state forests up on the central coast. So there's 4 state forests up there where we have some nest boxes to monitor for Pygmy Possums. And a selection of Antechinus also came from other smaller populations along the northern beaches.
Yeah, great. So they're relatively local. They're Sydney side are mammals, but just from the nearest big patches of bush, I guess, where they've persisted. Angela, we've got quite a few questions about the habitat pods. One is just about the degradable nature of them. And, I guess the wet weather has also been a bit of a trial for these structures made of cardboard. They are quite well designed. So they've got those struts in the middle that keep them up. But have you seen how well they stand up to weather conditions like those that we've had on the East Coast?
Yeah, so I've been checking on them every couple of months just to see kind of the rate of degradation. And they're actually holding up really well, especially considering how wet this year has been. So they're still more than half standing up. So we put 200 out in November last year, November, December. As of April, there were only about 50 that had degraded. And as of a couple of weeks ago when I checked last, there was only about 75 that had degraded out of the 200. So they're actually doing really well.
I guess that's in some ways a good thing too, that you're sort of demonstrating, they're not lasting around, sort of littering the landscape. His picture of some of those ones that have collapsed over that, more than, almost a year that they've been out in pretty wet conditions. So not too bad.
Yeah, and the ones that have been degrading are either closer to the cliffs, so a lot more exposed to the elements and especially wind, or ones that are on drainage lines. So they kind of just get wet and then just get knocked over.
Right. Oh, we've got another one here. Aiden, you might like to answer just about the prospects for any further species to be reintroduced to North Head beyond the 3 mammals that are establishing there now.
At this stage, we are just focusing on ensuring that these 3 do become established.
Great.
And I guess because of the size of North Head as well, we are a bit more limited in what we can reintroduce. And so if you try to go for anything larger, you'd soon start to run out of space, I guess.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Oh yeah, a good point here from one of our guests, that the genetic aspect of our reintroductions is covered in a recent article in Wildlife Matters. Good chance for me to plug the last edition of Wildlife Matters. So you can go to our website, australianwildlife.org, and read through that work. Another question here, just about North Head, the sanctuary itself. So I should have explained this more clearly, but in this case, it's not one of our feral predator-free or fenced reserves. So for people that are not from Sydney, it's actually publicly accessible and gets a really high level of visitation. It's got, you know, lovely boardwalks and lookouts. So it's not fenced, but I think, like you said, Aiden, it is a bit of an island. It's on quite a narrow isthmus. That means there's not so much invasion of cats and foxes out onto the headland. And we also monitor for those predators so that they can be controlled, you know, quite actively.
Yeah, that's right. And yeah, it's a kind of it's a collaborative effort. So we conduct our predator monitoring. So we have cameras out that monitor for the cats and foxes, but then they have detection dogs that come out to try and pick up on if there are foxes that may be using the headland. And luckily we haven't had detections of feral cats or foxes for a while. But considering the proximity to urbanization, incursions from pet cats are an issue. And so when cats are left free to roam at night, we do occasionally get some that are clearly pets with their collars wandering up to the headland.
Yeah. Thank you to everyone who's watched today. I just want to remind you that all of the work that AWC does is funded by charitable donations from people like you who really care about the future of Australian wildlife. If you've been inspired by this work and you'd like to contribute to AWC's work across Australia, delivering effective conservation for all of our animal species and their habitats, please go to australianwildlife.org and click on Support Us to make a donation. There you can also catch up on all of our projects around the country, and there's so much going on at the moment. There's an incredible level of activity, lots of exciting updates there. Also, don't forget to sign up to our email news updates. So there's a link on the website where you can do that. Thanks again, Angela and Aiden, and all the best with your work at North Head and with the PhD, Angela. It's great work that you're doing out there, and we're all really grateful that you're doing it.
Thanks, Joey. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Joey. Yeah, and thanks for tuning in.
Okay. Thanks very much, everyone. We'll talk to you next time.